A governor is the CEO of his or her state, the leader in charge of making sure the economy grows, working with the legislature to move the state forward, and providing the leadership to deliver effective and efficient services to constituents. But if a tornado or a wildfire rips through your state, or other catastrophe like a mass shooting happens, day-to-day governance can come to a halt. Crises require an immediate shift in priorities, and of course, by their very nature, they happen unexpectedly. While most crises will be handled at the state and local level, incidents like widespread power outages, industrial fires, and hazardous materials spills will require a presidential disaster declaration and will attract worldwide attention to a state. How a governor addresses a crisis, be it large or small, is critical and will have tremendous implications for the citizens of their states and the future of their governorship.
Perfect example of Washington State.
The worst is still coming, so keep yourself safe and use common sense.
We're dealing with unprecedented circumstances here. I mean, we're talking about 6 or 7 feet of snow in 14 days.
The waters are going to continue to rise in many areas, and so this is no time to let the guard down.
And with this unprecedented snowfall, we've been moving aggressively to access resources from around the region to support our cities and towns. Again, I ask that everyone who is able to please help out and shovel our sidewalks and our fire hydrants.
The immediate need is to restore calm and peace to the city, make people feel safe. We're going to make sure that we get Baltimore back on track.
As your governor, I call on each of us as Oregonians and as Americans to end gun violence now.
I am extremely encouraged by the amount of cooperation we have gotten from people.
As chief executives, governors take their duties seriously to ensure their state runs smoothly, both in times of relative stability and in times of crisis. NGA is a key resource that can help governors and their teams prepare to weather the day-to-day and the extraordinary.
That's a helpful reminder of all of our responsibilities, and it certainly reminded me of some governors that have done extraordinary work and provided incredible leadership during times of crisis. As chair of the NGA's Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee, I'm honored to chair today's session, Preparing the Extreme, Building Resilient Communities. As you know, our committee vice chair, Governor Kate Brown of Oregon, could not be with us today, but we are honored to have my good friend, Governor John Bel Edwards, to fill in for her. Governor, welcome. He is my neighbor. He's a great colleague, despite a few aggravations in SEC sports. Thank you for joining us today, and we have an important agenda, so we'll get to it. We have, as will be introduced shortly, the director of FEMA and Michael Berkowitz, 100 Resilient Cities. But I want to just preface the remarks by saying, as you could see from the video, that virtually every state gets hit at one time or another by a catastrophe, a natural disaster. In Arkansas, most recently, we've had flooding. And if Missouri would just contain their water, we'd be a lot better off. But water flows, and we've had flooding in Arkansas. 44 counties were designated as federal disaster areas, most recently in Arkansas, as a result of the flooding problems. I did want to mention, anytime you have a natural disaster, emergency communication is one of the critical areas, and calling upon my experience at Homeland Security, I understand the importance of that. And I just wanted to remind the governors that we have 90 days after the submission of the plan from FirstNet to either opt in or opt out. I made the decision, announced it this week, that we opted in for the FirstNet initiative representing Arkansas, and I just wanted to remind the governors of their responsibility in that regard. But the early presence of each of you on site is important, but I've learned when it comes to our flooding in Arkansas, the follow-up is just as critical. And I want to express my appreciation to FEMA for their early work and assessments and making the judgments as to what qualifies and the assistance that's provided. But I'm following up with our levee system. Levees can be operated by the Corps of Engineers. They could be privately operated or publicly operated, and the coordination of that levee system, if it is not coordinated well, can lead to even more flooding or flooding in unintended areas and great disputes. So that's a follow-up item that we have. And so it's my hope today that FEMA is going to educate us on all of this, as well as our other speaker, and that I know we'll have a good dialogue with everyone as they ask questions. Governor Edwards, I know that you'll have some things to add, and I welcome you as you introduce these speakers as well.
Thank you, Governor Hutchinson, and it's a pleasure to be here, and probably not as pretty as the governor from Oregon, but I'm going to do the best that I can. In Louisiana, we've been challenged a lot and often, and you all know about Hurricane Katrina, and certainly that was the biggest single challenge, but we've been challenged just about every year since then. And so resiliency, mitigation strategies around flooding, incredibly important. And as I mentioned, we have more experience than we would like in this area. What we've learned is you can't wait for the federal government, even though you want to have a good partnership, and we've been able to achieve good partnerships. You simply can't wait for them to provide the answers to the challenges associated with severe flooding. But relationships do matter, and I encourage all the governors to get to know personally their federal coordinating officer at FEMA, the regional administrator, and certainly Administrator Brock Long. Since I assumed office in January of 2016, Louisiana has received 4 separate declarations, and 57 of our 64 parishes have been declared major federal disasters. Some of that from tornadoes, but mostly from flooding. Currently, what I can tell you is there is a glaring gap between the immediate disaster mass sheltering operations and the long-term recovery housing options, and which is why sheltering and temporary essential power, which is known as STEP, was an attempt by FEMA to fill this gap by creating a program that actually doesn't fit within the confines of the Stafford Act and subsequent federal regulations. So the state, working with the STEP guidelines, developed the Shelter at Home program after the August 2016 flood. This program provides minimal repairs, temporary repairs, simply to make a home habitable, safe, and secure, so that you don't have entire communities who are depopulating and moving elsewhere, which is something that we did experience with Hurricane Katrina. The Shelter at Home purchased the state and its residents' resiliency. Even if the residents didn't immediately begin to live in their home, the home didn't suffer from mold infestation and become otherwise abandoned later on, so that they were able to return home. I can tell you that we're continuing to work with FEMA to improve the program, and we've recommended to make it permanent, because if we can make it permanent, you can actually have contracts before the disasters hit, and you can negotiate those contracts, you can get a better price, and that saves time, effort, and energy after the storm when you have to sit down with FEMA to negotiate the parameters of that program, then go out to a request for proposals and receive bids and award the contract. You'll be able to get to that much faster. The other thing that I would encourage FEMA to do, and I know that Administrator Brock Long is working on this, is the manufactured housing units where they're available in state, because you have a manufacturer in state or because you have significant inventories, that they be able to, that the states be able to purchase and then be reimbursed from FEMA in accordance with strict guidelines, I know. So we've got lots of challenges around resiliency in a state that suffers from coastal erosion, and we need more resources to direct at restoration and protection activities. So resiliency is a huge issue for us in Louisiana. And I had a lot more remarks planned, but I'm going to stop here because I know that we have to get to our guests. And I want to introduce, and we're very proud to have with us today, Administrator Rock Long, who is the administrator of FEMA. And I do want to acknowledge that we know that you have a hard stop at noon, so I want to make sure that the other folks here know that as well. And then Michael Berkowitz, president of 100 Resilient Cities. And I can tell you that both of you in the state of Louisiana and your agencies, your entities have made a tremendous difference for my citizens. And so I just want to thank you very much for that, and thank you for being here. And the program is now yours.
All right. Thank you, Governors. It's truly an honor to be here. It's an honor to serve the nation in this capacity. And I'm a diplomat by nature, and one thing that you will get from me is working through the issues that I want to organize FEMA in a manner that helps you achieve your preparedness, response, and recovery goals, as well as mitigation. It is a partnership. If there's a failure at any one of the levels, whether it's local, state, or federal levels, I believe that we fail together, and we can't afford for that to happen. And so we have to design programs in a manner that does increase resiliency. FEMA is incredibly active. Even though we're not in the news very much right now, we are actually working 24 different disasters in 18 states. We have 4 or 5 more disasters that are actually in queue where we're conducting PDAs, and maybe some of your states as well, that we're trying to expedite those because, as I said on Thursday morning, I believe that governors should, we should render a quick decision as fast as we can to let you know what type of assistance is available or not. Regarding resilience, what scares me the most is I don't believe that we've built a true culture of preparedness within our citizens. I believe in what I call hazard amnesia, okay? We've had some bad disasters. We've had Sandy, we've had Matthew, we've had flooding. But one of the things that keeps me up at night is this nation has not seen the devastation of a major landfalling hurricane since 2005. You know, so sometimes I think we forget the worst. We have not seen a devastating earthquake in some time, and I go to sleep with that every night. So FEMA can't do this alone. We are a partner with your states. I have to understand the gaps that each of you faces and how we can meet in the middle, how we can help you to overcome those gaps through pre-disaster funding, or how we maximize disaster recovery funding when it becomes in your state. Because what I don't want to do is come into your state, set up joint field offices, spend a lot of money, and repeat the cycle over and over and over again. Hopefully, the experience with FEMA is positive and we leave you better and stronger for the next time that you have to face it. Achieving resiliency is a partnership. I look at resiliency in two different pots. There's the citizen, and then there's the public infrastructure side, okay? On the public infrastructure side, it's amazing to me to look that FEMA on average puts out about $8 billion a year in recovery funding to rebuild after the disaster. How do we get that money up front? How do we put that money up front is the question that I ask. So there was a period between 2011 and 2014 where GAO report found that FEMA put out $3.2 billion in post-disaster mitigation funding in that 3-year period. During the same time frame, we were able to cough up $222 million on the pre-disaster side. It's flip-flopped. It should be flip-flopped. It's backwards. And it's not just as easy. If I could have been sworn in and signed a document within an hour that said we're going to move the post-disaster mitigation funding to the front side, I would have done it right off the bat. I would have put it up there because I do believe that pre-disaster mitigation is the key to reducing future disaster costs. Let's invest now, and let's put it forward. It can't just be FEMA funding alone. It's got to be priority in state budgets as well as local budgets as well. And I know, having served as a cabinet level director for the Alabama Emergency Management Agency working under Governor Bob Riley, I understand the demands on state budgets and general funds and the cutbacks. I understand that's hard. I get that. But I do believe we have to focus on the pre-disaster. I have a tough job ahead of me. I need your help, helping us understand how to navigate that. It will require the help of Congress to be able to move some of that funding to the front side. When it comes to citizens, as I said earlier, I'm not sure that our Be Ready programs have actually hit the mark. You know, something that's very sensitive and something to talk about is I believe that asset poverty, not poverty, asset poverty, your ability to put your hand on cash right now, $500. The majority of Americans can't do it, and they can't overcome the simple medical emergency or activate insurance or, basically absorb the cost of having to evacuate, the fuel cost. And many of our campaigns are saying, go out, be ready, buy all this supplies for the next 3 days. That's important, but it may be an unrealistic ask in many communities right now. And I think we have to rethink that and form different partnerships with the Department of Education and others and train people to have their own rainy day fund. The other thing that we have to look at is we've called our citizens disaster victims. We've called them disaster survivors. I look at our citizens as the true first responder. A majority of time, FEMA is not a first response agency. As governors, you realize we don't roll in. We're not there right after the disaster. It takes time for us to come into place, and there's a whole process that takes place. But if you look at cyber attacks, if you look at active shooter, in Alabama, after a tornado hits, your neighbor was most likely the first one to do search and rescue. And so we have to think about the way we train our citizens and refocus these programs to give them life-saving skills. Come back to CPR, how to shut off the water valves to your homes. How can they do simple search and rescue in their communities after they face these disasters? I think we have to take a comprehensive look at what we're asking citizens to do, but empower them to be a part of that response. Get them included in our training and exercise as well. In closing, I'm gonna keep it there. On the housing side, Governor Edwards hit the nail on the head. We only have so much capability that we can bring down, and it is my job to coordinate the firepower of the federal government down through you governors, ultimately to the incident command level. That's my job. We only have so much that we can bring to the table. For example, in housing, there's only so many manufactured homes that are available right now, and it takes a certain amount of time to get many of them built. So how do we do things smarter from the standpoint of how do we make sure that we implement proper rapid repairs programs or STEP programs, as the good governor talked about? How do we do that, keep people in their homes without having to bring in manufactured housing or temporary housing onto those locations? Are we maximizing economy sharing platforms such as Airbnb? If you can rent them, that's the best thing to do. And in many cases, when rural areas are hit, the only option is a manufactured home, and I get that. But how can each one of the states, I believe it's my time to give guidance on the pre-event contracts. I believe that you guys can control your own destiny a little bit more by setting up the right pre-event contracts, whether it's hiring firms to help you navigate disaster recovery cost, or whether it's setting up your own vendor-managed logistics systems. There's got to be private companies that do water every day in your states, signing MOUs with them to basically say, hey, can I have 100 truckloads of water at market price if we get hit, so that you're rolling forward the first 24, 48 hours of water until I can backfill the system on logistics, and let me reimburse you for that first 4,800 hours through the Stafford Act. So there are, I think we have to clearly say, here are some of the things that you can do as no-cost retainer contracts until they're turned on, to be a little more prepared and to help the system as we go forward in there. So I'm going to stop there. But one more thing, recovery is fragmented. It's incredibly fragmented in this country. There are studies out there where everybody is saying reduce the disaster costs, which I believe we can do that. And a lot of that is by reducing complexity. There's over 200 different policies that guide FEMA recovery alone, which is way too much. It's confusing. It leads to bad decisions. It leads to negative OIG reports. And it's tough for local governments to keep up with all of that. The other thing is that FEMA is not the only one that's providing funding. There are numerous funds out there when it comes to disaster recovery. They come from HUD, they come from CDBG-DER funds, they come from SBA, there's economic injury loans, there's the Army Corps of Engineers that comes in. What are the big data systems that help governors understand how to formulate their recovery goals and maximize all that funding to do the greatest good when it comes down and it comes available? I don't think as a nation we have actually come together to do that, and I want to help. I want to figure out, I've got to stretch across our federal partners to figure out how we work in concert with one another, but also say, you know, Governor Hutchinson, based on this disaster that you've had and the impacts that you're experiencing, here's the best way we would encourage you to help. But I don't know how Arkansas should recover better than you, you know, but we've got to be able to figure out how to use that funding down. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor Hutchinson, Governor Edwards. Nice to be here, and Administrator Long. Thank you for your thoughtful remarks. I'm Michael Berkowitz. I'm the president of 100 Resilient Cities. We're a $164 million organization funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to build urban resilience in 100 cities around the world. We actually have 100 cities in 48 countries across 6 continents. So I greatly appreciate the ability to take a train a couple of hours here. The travel is certainly better. We're charged with helping cities build urban resilience to the social, economic, and physical challenges of the 21st century. And like the administrator, I'm here to talk about flooding and flood resilience. While conventional responses like hard infrastructure and emergency response are important to our efforts to limit flood impacts, those alone are not enough. Instead, I'm here to advocate for a more powerful and cost-effective approaches that improve the lives of city residents long before disaster strikes. I'm here to advocate for building resilience. And what do I mean when I say resilience? Because that is a word that gets tossed around a lot. It's the capacity to survive and thrive in the face of disaster. But don't just think about the sudden disasters, the shocks, the earthquake, hurricane, terrorism, tornadoes. Also think about the long-term, slow-burning disasters, long-term food, water, and energy shortages, high levels of crime and violence, aging infrastructure. Those can also impact cities. And I first learned the importance of resilience building while I was working at the Office of Emergency Management. I served as Deputy Commissioner in New York City between 1998 and 2005 under Mayors Giuliani and Bloomberg. And in that role, I spent a lot of the 90s preparing and tracking hurricanes and helping the city prepare for them. And then on 9/11, 2 planes flew into 2 buildings, and the world, New York, and our country were changed forever. Next came anthrax attacks, a plane crash in Queens, the 2003 blackout, the global financial crisis, and only then, in 2012, did we have a Hurricane Sandy. And New York survived and thrived through those incidents. And it's worth just pointing out that this week marks the 40th anniversary of the 1977 blackout in New York City. You know, we had a blackout in July of 1977, and the city was impacted by riots for the next several days afterwards. And you contrast that with what happened in 2003, and you understand how it's not just emergency response and infrastructure that determines whether or not a city, a state, or a country can survive in the face of shocks and stresses, but rather it's a much broader approach. And these experiences underscore an important insight that infrastructure and emergency response are important to prepare a city for the worst, but it's also critical to focus on robust, diversified economies, cohesive communities where neighbors check on neighbors, integrated leadership with strong stakeholders at the table. The same lesson can be drawn from Hurricane Katrina in Governor Edwards' state, which killed nearly 2,000 people, displaced hundreds of thousands of Americans, and cost nearly $150 billion. And to understand what went wrong, it's not enough to look at how warm the Gulf was, what the state of the infrastructure was, how big the storm was. Those are all important. But you also need to consider the local economy, the transportation systems, public health, civic leadership, political leadership. And looking at flooding in a vacuum would be to ignore those exacerbating factors. And the truth is, you rarely know what disaster will strike next and how it will play out. If you think you do, the chances are that you're fighting the last war. This is, the all hazards preparedness that FEMA so appropriately espouses. The resilience mindset challenges us to look at issues in a comprehensive way, to commit to tackling multiple problems with each investment. It's a simple approach. focus on building strength with every intervention, and become better prepared for whatever happens next. And so how does resilience building work in practice? And to answer that question, I'm going to just share 3 quick real-world examples, and I'll start by talking a little bit more about New York City, my hometown. So New York is surrounded by water. It has nearly 700 miles of coastline alone, and rising tides and hurricanes have the potential to create flooding that could cripple the city, the region, and our national economy. And a traditional response to a threat like this would be to build a seawall. You know, you have engineers and planners, make some estimates, and we have a few. We have a few visuals. You have engineers and planners calculate worst case scenarios, make some estimates, add some buffer, and pour concrete. But there's a better and more powerful way, and likely a cost-effective option. Building a wall might help New York survive this particular threat, but it would fail to strengthen the city more broadly. Why not address the threat of flooding while simultaneously tackling other challenges like dwindling public space and neighborhood isolation? Following Sandy, and in partnership with state and federal government, the city came up with a project called the Big U, and you can see it here. It's a ring of green infrastructure protecting Lower Manhattan that will run 10 continuous miles. It's not just a method of flood protection. Each of the sections provide innovative solutions to challenges facing the surrounding neighborhood. For example, new pedestrian paths incentivize exercise, combating obesity and other public health issues. Trees and other greenery mitigate the effects of the urban heat island, which makes Manhattan hotter than the surrounding areas. And new public spaces engage residents so that neighbors meet neighbors, which is something that you shouldn't take for granted in the big city. The Big U will protect New York City from flooding, but that's not all it will do. It will also strengthen the city socially and economically, connecting New Yorkers with one another, making the city stronger and more resilient no matter what the next crisis it faces next. The next example I want to share with you is about the work being done in Governor McAuliffe's home state of Virginia in Norfolk. It's this coastal city, which is famous for shipbuilding and the world's largest naval base, is perhaps one of the most flood-prone cities in the country. Norfolk is turning this challenge of rising sea level, river flooding, and land subsidence into an opportunity for economic development and community engagement. And led by Christine Morris, the city's Chief Resilience Officer, the city has heeded the gospel of resilience. Instead of just digging up historic creeks to channel floodwater, Norfolk is turning those creeks into gathering spaces for the public and real estate for new construction and much-needed housing. Norfolk isn't looking at flooding through a myopic lens. They're taking a more holistic approach. The city is tackling multiple issues at once, making the most of every dollar spent. And in doing so, they are poised to be stronger and more prepared for the future no matter what comes next. This type of long-term, comprehensive thinking is resilience building at its best, and others are taking note. Last year, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, awarded $120 million to support projects laid out in Norfolk's resilience strategy. I believe those were the biggest grant the city ever received in its history. And the private sector is similarly enthusiastic. Moody's, the credit rating agency, published a paper last year on the Hampton Roads credit posture in the face of climate change. And the agency maintained strong credit ratings even in the face of this threat. And as surely every governor knows, accessing credit for investments in infrastructure and innovation is essential to building strong cities and a strong state. Building the resilient coastal city of the future isn't easy, but Norfolk is tackling its challenges head-on and is already reaping the benefits. There's one more example of resilience in action that I'd like to discuss today, and I would be remiss if I left this room without returning to New Orleans and the home state of Governor Edwards. As I alluded to earlier, New Orleans has learned important lessons about what it takes to overcome natural disasters and build a vibrant and resilient city that serves all its residents. one of the first cities to release a comprehensive resilience strategy. They did it on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. New Orleans has developed actionable plans on topics ranging from equity and energy to education and emergency planning. And I want to point out one more example of resilient flood approach here, and that's the first of its kind resilience district that the city is creating in the neighborhood of Gentilly, which was made famous by a photo taken right after Katrina of houses fully submerged. Gentilly is now undergoing a consolidated effort to reduce flood risk, slow land subsidence, and encourage neighborhood revitalization. And this is part of a new trend that we're seeing in progressive cities and states all over the world. They're moving away from thinking about the city as a funnel and trying to treat the city as a sponge. Instead of trying to get rid of the water through pipes and stormwater systems, Gentilly is building green infrastructure, and you can see it here, that will allow the water to be safely retained on site. This approach has multiple benefits. It slows subsidence by restoring some of the water table. It reduces the risk of catastrophic failure, and will create public space that serves the residents in both good times and bad. Put simply, New Orleans is learning to live with water rather than fight it, and is turning its greatest challenge into a valued asset. So I've talked about New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, and all three we see as leaders in our network. But let me make a couple of direct asks to you as the governors. First, you should consider hiring a chief resilience officer for your state and empowering them with broad authority to cut across sectors and silos. Charging someone with this task will make it easier to realize the resilience dividend that I've been talking about. 2 states, and there are several others that are considering this, have already done so. Then, with every dollar you spend to address flooding, I'd encourage you to ask, how can this investment address multiple challenges to strengthen my state? And what collateral benefits can we reap? And this is not going to be easy, because the reason why we have sectors and silos is because transportation people want to talk to transportation people, housing people want to talk to housing people. But if we continue to push this interdisciplinary approach, we will reap the benefits of resilience in the way that I'm talking about. Building resilience is recognizing that shocks and stresses are interconnected, that solutions should be too. Trying to solve single challenges with single solutions may have worked in the past, but today that approach is not only unwise but also untenable. Mitigating the threat of flooding in and of itself isn't enough. The focus needs to be on developing responses that build social and economic capital. So finally, one last thought, and I'm a cities person, so please forgive me for being so forward. But when you're thinking about how to solve problems at the state level, I urge you to look at your cities to see solutions being tested in real time. Just as states are famously known as laboratories of democracy for the federal government, you have the opportunity to treat cities as laboratories of innovation, practical solutions, and implementations for your state. Cities around the country are doing incredible work to ensure their residents remain safe and strong, to ensure their infrastructure works the way residents need it to, and to ensure that a changing climate and globalizing economy and urbanizing landscape will not catch them unprepared. We can face the challenges of our time and come out ahead. We can reduce the risks of disaster, from flooding to joblessness, to terrorism, to social strife. And we can translate the micro of cities to the macro of states, from a district in New Orleans to the entire United States. Together, working together, we can become more resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Administrator Long, and Mr. Berkowitz as well. Excellent presentations. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and let me kick it off, Administrator Long, with a couple of questions to you. In April of last year, 35 states responded to an inquiry from FEMA and reactions on the state deductible plan. So I'd like for you to update us on where that is in the rulemaking process and what your expectation is as to the outcome. And then if you could also comment, we had a discussion right before about the levees and the concern about it, and as to what you think we ought to be doing to have a better coordination of our levee system.
Sure. So the levee ones is pretty easy for me right now. I have to go work with our partners at the Army Corps of Engineers to make sure that our partnership is very clear, that we have clear roles and responsibilities, so that when we come out into a state, we're giving you the proper guidance and helping you understand what you're entitled to from the federal government to improve those or maintain those levees. The disaster deductible is interesting. So I understand the premise of the program and why FEMA initially went down this path. And basically the premise is good in my opinion, and it's, to me, it is how are state and locals increasing and emphasizing emergency management and disaster resiliency, and federal government is coming down and we're meeting in the middle, somewhere. The process of the PA disaster deductible program as currently written, I have some problems with. And I've heard very loud and clear that many states also have problems with its current form. So I have to go back and evaluate the PA deductible, but I don't want to basically start handing out policy that I know a majority of states are unhappy with. So I'm very aware of that issue.
Grateful for you taking a fresh look at that.
Thank you.
I've got a question for Michael Berkowitz. We are in Louisiana because of subsidence and sea level rise and coastal erosion. We're actually taking entire communities and relocating them, and we're starting that process now with an American Indian community. And even though it's going to be relatively small in terms of a large city like New Orleans or New York, I'm just wondering if what you were talking about in terms of resiliency and building it in, whether that has application for these small communities when we move them north and put them on higher ground, so that we can structure that in a way that achieves many of the things that you were talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. I think the way that relates to resilience is twofold. One is, to your point, that we do the right risk assessments to understand what the scenarios are going to be, so that we appropriately relocate communities to somewhere that's less vulnerable than where they came from, right? And that we take a long-term view. We're never going to be able to predict everything that happens, but we'll take a long-term view of what that means. The second is, I think the process that we go through in order to work with those communities is every bit as valuable as what the ultimate outcome is in a technical sense. If we do the right kind of stakeholder and community engagement, if we make sure that those communities are felt heard, that will make sure that the communities feel more empowered, bought into what's going on at the state and national level, and ultimately that will make them better citizens and residents in the next disaster, whatever that happens to be, whether that's the BP oil spill, tornado, rainwater flooding, or a hurricane. And I just give you one very quick example of that from the project I talked about in New York, the Big U. The designers proposed some really innovative solutions around creating buildings with wet feet, that they would relocate people on the ground floors in public housing in very vulnerable areas in New York, build a new tower, make those buildings be able to withstand flooding and turn them into like community centers. That's classic sort of mitigation action, and from my eyes, it looked great as a technical solution. But the community didn't trust the city in order to follow through. And ultimately, that design was scrapped. And I think from a resilience standpoint, that community feedback was listened to, was heard, even if it led to something that might not have been the most optimal technical solution. That will make that community more resilient because those community members feel a better sense of empowerment and alignment.
To governors, any questions? Governor McCullough.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank both the administrator for coming here today. And Michael, I can't thank you enough. I think it was January of 2016 that you and the Department of HUD gave Virginia $120 million to deal with our resiliency issues. And I just want to thank you for that. We've put it to great work. We have all new evacuation plans that I just announced last month to move people. Outside of Louisiana, Virginia is the second most vulnerable region in America. And you rightfully put up the largest naval base in the world. And I just got a report on my desk the other day with a 3-foot sea level rise, we'll lose $90 billion worth of infrastructure and real estate in the Hampton Roads region in Virginia. So I now have all the citizens, well, whether they believe in climate change or not, they are all aware of it today, and we are all working together. And it would not have happened without that HUD and that Rockefeller Foundation to really kickstart. So I want to thank you. And to the new FEMA administrator, I want to thank you. We have had a great relationship with Craig Fugate and FEMA, and it's just an outstanding organization. On behalf of all the governors, I just want to thank FEMA for their quick response and look forward to, I say look forward to working with you. I hope I don't have to work with you, but in the event we do, I just want to thank you for the efficiency.
We will be working together.
Thank you.
Well, I'll join in my thanks. Thanks for both of you being here. Great presentation. Let me Administrator, one of the things, understandably, is the focus is these large disasters that happen in large urban areas. And, of course, being so much of our inside the country is very rural areas, FEMA responds to a lot of relatively small disasters in terms of population. But all those more, at least equally significant to the citizens that live in a small town. And so one is, again, a thanks. I think FEMA has done a very good job doing that. I was interested in your comments about how you want to become more proactive in the dollars that FEMA has to spend, which I conceptually think is a wonderful idea. But how do you we respond to the 100-year flood, to the tornadoes that we didn't know were coming, to the wildfires that were set or were hit by lightning strikes, that you have to respond to after the fact in some fashion. So is there better predictive analytics in terms of weather that you're looking at? How are you going to provide with that? If you said you would have done day one, switch that money around, which would have been significant. How do you respond to those things that still seem very difficult to predict, particularly in very rural areas?
So the rural governments face the toughest time because what typically happens, and having served in Alabama, 67 counties, several of these counties have less than 15,000 people in them. And in many cases, you would have tornadoes go through, wipe out significant infrastructure in a very rural area, but the state would not come close to its numeric indicators to ask for presidential assistance and the public assistance side. That's a tough situation, and I get it. The ask on that is how many states actually have a rainy day fund to handle the PA and IA needs when FEMA assistance is not coming for that type of event. That's just an ask, and work with your state directors to understand how something like that should be set up. And maybe we step away from the PA deductible and we start rewarding states for being able to prove that they have these systems set up to handle those hard case situations. The other thing is the disaster relief fund is where a majority of post-disaster funds come out of now for mitigation. So on average, we put out about $1 billion a year on average from the disaster relief fund. I can't just move that money. It would require a change in the Stafford Act that dictates that the funding where it is, and that's a lot of work ahead of us. This is a goal that we have to work together on to make sure that we can move that out. The other problem that we face for the increasing number of disasters is the Budget Control Act. I think we all understand why the Budget Control Act was passed, but for FEMA, it's a very negative thing. And what I mean by that is that every year, because of the formula that the Budget Control Act uses, it basically says Katrina and Sandy never happened. So every year, the average that gets funded goes lower and lower and lower, despite the fact that disasters are going up. So, with that, one, we have to all make a stand that we're going to do pre-disaster mitigation from a whole community perspective, as Michael and I have both been putting forward. And two, that's something else that I've got to tackle that I recognize. So there's pressure to possibly start fighting wildfires on federal lands. There's cyber attacks. There's new hazards and different things that the Budget Control Act doesn't recognize. The Act doesn't recognize changing environments. The other thing is that I believe in climate variability as well. And what I mean by that is when I was first at FEMA, first came on board in FEMA, and I interviewed with FEMA on the morning of 9/11, and I watched a lot of changes, and I went through some of the best and tough times at FEMA. But I worked in the National Hurricane Center for basically 5 or 6 summers, directly, helping interpret forecast and basically turning that forecast into risk and vulnerabilities, helping governors make evacuation decisions or local governments do that. And I learned that through climate variability, there are also intrinsic cycles that increase and decrease periods of hurricane activity. There's El Nino that oscillates every 5 to 7 years, which means freak nor'easter snowstorms, tornadoes in areas that don't necessarily get them. There's also flooding. So there's a lot of educating to do about how to recognize the trends, the intrinsic cycles going around the globe at any given time that increase and decrease the periods of what we're seeing. And so I used to make the presentation that in 1995, because of a cycle called thermohaline circulation, the ocean's conveyor belt, we're getting ready to see an increased period of hurricane activity over the next 2 or 3 decades. And all that infrastructure that we put without building codes or proper land use planning, we're about to pay for that. And it's happening. And so we're going to go through those cycles. There's a lot out of my control, but what I can control, I'm going to work hard on to be able to get it up front.
Thank you. Just to follow up, Administrator, again, we want to thank you for the work. To the extent it helps you save any money, we haven't had a hurricane in Wyoming for a long time, so you're good there.
Governor Scott.
Administrator Long, I want to thank you for your leadership and assistance with our disaster. It was with Irene not too many years ago, and it was devastating for our state, but it was a great partnership that we were able to work with you in getting us through that. The struggle for us was in the recovery stage in implementation of some of the rules and regulations revolving around the replacement of infrastructure, the sizing of culverts, and the replacement of bridges, when it didn't make sense in some respects to rebuild in the same size. I think some of the rules dictated that it had to be rebuilt to the exact same standards as was there previous to the disaster. And I'm not sure that if you've changed that since then, but if you haven't, I'd implore you to look at that. Because when you're looking to rebuild, certainly with all the frequency of storms and climate change being at the forefront, that we could use that flexibility in the future when we're rebuilding to make sure that we're, the resiliency is real, that we're rebuilding for the future as well.
Sure. And I want to be able to design. So right now, currently, FEMA is working on what's called a PA re-engineering program. It's a new concept to streamline the services. And as I said earlier, we have nearly 200 policies that dictate how you do recovery. And that includes whether it's an environmental impact assessment or benefit cost analysis and many things. And in some cases, I think FEMA gets in the way of interpreting your contracts. All I want to make sure is that you followed your bid laws and not get in. And I want to provide you that maximum flexibility with what's there. So honestly, we've already started a Reduce the Complexity campaign inside FEMA now. And part of that is with the PA re-engineering program, to where we're really trying to try different things in different states to basically meet your need and make it as painless as possible. When you have to hire a consulting firm to navigate FEMA recovery, it's too complex.
Yeah, thank you for that. We did appreciate the good partnership, though.
I know that you've got a schedule to meet. We're grateful for each of yours participation and leadership on cities, resiliency, and even though Administrator Long did not bring us any good news for the future, talking about El Nino, we know that you're going to provide great leadership for our nation, and we're grateful for your service. So with that, I think we stand adjourned unless Chairman McAuliffe, do you have any concluding words? Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.